The moment Frank Barnes agreed to marry a complete stranger for a cow, he knew folks would call him desperate. They weren't wrong. But when his new bride locked their bedroom door on their wedding night, leaving him standing in the hallway with nothing but confusion, he realized this deal was more complicated than he'd bargained for. The woman they all called fat and undesirable had secrets, and that cow was just the beginning of a story neither of them saw coming. Frank wasn't always this desperate. His father had built their ranch with his own 2 hands, turning wild Texas land into something worth passing down. But 3 years of drought had turned the green pastures brown and dry. The crops withered in the fields. The few cattle he had left were skin and bones, barely worth selling. Every morning, Frank woke up knowing he was one bad day away from losing everything his family had worked for. He'd tried everything honest men do when times get hard. He'd asked the bank for more time on his loan, but they wanted their money. He'd offered to work other ranches for extra cash, but everyone was struggling. He'd even thought about selling, but who would buy a dying ranch? The only thing that could save him now was a miracle, or at least a healthy cow that could give milk and maybe birth some calves. One good cow could mean the difference between keeping his land and watching the bank take it all. That's when the letter came. It was from a matchmaker in Dallas, a woman who specialized in unusual arrangements. She had a client, a woman named Emma, who needed a husband. This woman came with a dowry that included 1 strong Holstein cow, proven to give good milk. All Frank had to do was marry her, sight unseen. No courtship, no questions asked. Just say yes, and the cow was his. The day Emma arrived in town, everyone came out to look. Word had spread about Frank's mail-order bride, and folks wanted to see what kind of woman would need to buy herself a husband with livestock. When she stepped off the stagecoach, the whispers started immediately. She was a large woman, taller than most men and built solid. Her dress was plain bound wool, her hair pulled back tight. She didn't smile or wave. She just stood there, holding 1 small bag, waiting. The townspeople didn't hold back their opinions. They called her fat, said she was too big for any normal man to want. Some of the women clicked their tongues and shook their heads, wondering what was wrong with her that she couldn't find a husband the regular way. The men made jokes about Frank needing a stronger bed frame. Nobody saw her as a person. They just saw her size and made their judgments.
Dearly beloved,
the wedding happened that same afternoon in the town's small church. There were no flowers, no music, no celebration. Just Frank in his 1 good shirt, Emma in her brown dress, and the preacher saying the words as fast as he could. They didn't kiss. They barely looked at each other. When it was done, Frank loaded her bag onto his wagon, helped her up, and they rode to his ranch in silence. The cow, as promised, was delivered an hour later. That evening, after a quiet supper of beans and cornbread, Frank figured they should probably talk about sleeping arrangements. He walked to the bedroom, the only one in his small house, and found the door shut tight. He tried the handle, locked from the inside. He knocked gently, not wanting to seem demanding on their first night as husband and wife. No answer came. He could hear her moving around inside, but she didn't respond to his knocking or his quiet calls of her name. Confused and tired, Frank grabbed the blanket and settled into the old chair by the fireplace. His back would hurt in the morning, but what else could he do? He'd married this woman for her cow, not for love, but he'd expected they'd at least share the normal parts of marriage. As he tried to get comfortable in that hard chair, he wondered what kind of arrangement he'd really gotten himself into. The next morning, Frank woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone working outside. His back ached from the chair, and his neck was stiff. He stumbled to the window and saw Emma already out by the barn hauling water to the animals. The sun was barely up, but she moved with purpose, like she'd been doing ranch work her whole life. By the time he got dressed and went outside, she'd fed the chickens, milked the new cow, and was examining the broken pump by the well. She didn't say good morning. She didn't explain about the locked door. She just pointed at the pump and said her first words to him since arriving. These 3 words were practical and direct. The mechanism inside was rusted but fixable. She'd need some wire and oil. Did he have any? Frank nodded, still too surprised to speak, and fetched what she needed from the tool shed. Emma fixed that pump in 20 minutes, doing what Frank hadn't been able to figure out in weeks. When water started flowing again, clear and steady, she simply nodded and moved on to the next task. She found things he'd missed, like a small spring near the eastern boundary of his property, hidden by brush. It wasn't much water, but it was enough to irrigate a vegetable garden. She showed him how to build channels to direct the water, how to plant in rows that would make the most of what little they had. Days turned into weeks, and the locked door became their routine. Every night, Emma would retire to the bedroom and lock herself in. Every morning, she'd be up before dawn, working harder than any hired hand ever had. She never complained about the poor food or the hard work. She just kept her head down and kept the ranch running. Frank started leaving a cup of water outside her door each night, a small gesture to show he noticed her efforts. In the morning, the cup would be empty, placed neatly back outside. The townspeople weren't as quiet about their arrangement. When Frank went to town for supplies, the other men would elbow each other and laugh. They'd ask him how it felt to be locked out of his own bedroom, whether his wife was too good for him, or whether she was hiding something worse than her size. Silas Crawford, who owned the ranch next to Frank's and had been trying to buy him out for years, was the worst of them. He'd make loud jokes about Frank's marriage, saying things that made other folks uncomfortable, but got nervous laughs anyway. One day at the general store, Silas went too far. He said Emma was probably locking the door because she was embarrassed by her own body, that no man could want a woman that big. Before Frank could respond, Emma walked in to pick up flour. She heard every word. The store went silent. Silas grinned, waiting for her to cry or run. Instead, she walked right up to the counter, did her business, and left without acknowledging him. But Frank saw her hands shaking as she carried the flour to the wagon. That evening, for the first time, Emma spoke more than just practical words. She was sitting on a porch, mending a torn feed sack, when Frank brought her a cup of coffee. He thanked her for not making a scene in town, said Silas was a fool who didn't know quality when he saw it. Emma set down her sewing and looked at him with eyes that held old pain. She told him she'd been married before. Her first husband had seemed kind during their courtship, but after the wedding, he changed. He was cruel in ways she didn't want to describe. He'd lock her in rooms when he was angry, control what she ate, who she could see. When he died in a saloon fight, everyone expected her to mourn, but all she felt was relief. The locked door wasn't about Frank. It was her promise to herself that no man would ever trap her again. She needed to know she could leave if she had to. Frank listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her he understood. He'd married her for the cow, that was true, but he'd never force anything on her. She could lock that door every night for the rest of their lives if it made her feel safe. He just wanted her to know that she didn't have to be afraid of him. He wasn't that kind of man. Something shifted between them after that conversation. They still didn't talk much, but their silence became comfortable instead of awkward. They worked side by side, building up the ranch piece by piece. The cow Emma brought was everything promised and more, giving rich milk and eventually bearing a healthy calf. The garden she'd planted started producing vegetables. For the first time in years, Frank felt hope that he might actually keep his father's land. Then came the night that changed everything. Frank woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling wood. He jumped from his chair and ran outside to see flames eating at the barn back wall. The cow and her calf were inside, along with all their feed for the winter. Without thinking, he ran toward the fire, but the heat drove him back. This was no accident. The fire was spreading too fast, too deliberately. Someone had set this. Emma burst from the house, took one look at the situation, and sprang into action. She didn't panic or cry. She ran to the spring she'd found, dunking every blanket and cloth she could find in the water. While Frank used buckets to fight the flames directly, she created a barrier of wet blankets between the fire and the rest of the barn. Her strength, the same size that made people mock her, let her carry loads that would have broken Frank's back. Together they fought the fire through the night. Emma's quick thinking with the wet blankets stopped the flames from spreading to the main structure. Frank managed to get the animals out safely. When the sun came up, They were both black with soot, exhausted, but victorious. The barn's back wall was destroyed, but the rest stood firm. The cow and calf were scared but unharmed. The sheriff found evidence that Silas Crawford had set the fire. Boot prints, a dropped matchbox from the saloon Silas frequented, and finally, a witness who'd seen him riding away from Frank's property just before the flames started. Silas had wanted to force Frank to sell, and when it became clear that Emma's help was saving the ranch, he'd gotten desperate. They arrested him that morning, pulling him from his own breakfast table. That night, exhausted and still smelling of smoke, Frank went to wash up before settling into his chair. But when he passed the bedroom, he noticed something different. Door was open, not just unlocked, but standing wide open. Emma sat on the edge of the bed, still in her soot-stained dress, looking at him with an expression he'd never seen before. She told him to come in. He hesitated at the threshold, not wanting to assume anything. She patted the space beside her on the bed, and he sat down carefully, like the moment might shatter if he moved too fast. They sat there in silence for a moment before she spoke. She said she'd married him because she needed somewhere to belong, somewhere people wouldn't hurt her. She'd brought the cow because that was all she had of value. But tonight, fighting that fire together, she realized something. This wasn't just somewhere to hide anymore. This was home. Frank admitted his own truth. He'd been so desperate for that cow, so focused on saving the ranch, that he'd agreed to marry without thinking about the person he was binding himself to. But these past weeks, watching her work, seeing her strength and intelligence, had changed him. The ranch was important, but it wasn't everything anymore. She was his partner in ways he'd never expected. The respect he felt for her had grown into something deeper, something he didn't quite have words for yet. They talked through the night, really talked, about their fears and hopes, about the ranch and what they could build together, about the pain in their pasts and the possibility of a future that belonged to both of them.
I can't believe we made it through that.
Me neither. We need to rest.
When morning came, they walked out of that bedroom together, ready to face whatever came next as true partners. The ranch prospered after that. With Emma's practical knowledge and Frank's determination, they built something neither could have managed alone. The cow that had brought them together became the foundation of the growing herd. The garden expanded into fields of vegetables they sold in town. The same people who had mocked them now bought their milk and produce, forced to admit that the strange couple had made something remarkable. But more than the ranch succeeded, two lonely people who the world had written off as too desperate, too poor, too large, or too broken, had found something precious. They'd found respect that grew into partnership that grew into love. Not the storybook kind that comes with flowers and poetry, but the real kind that comes from fighting fires together, from understanding each other's broken places, from choosing each other every day, despite how they'd started. The locked door that had defined their first weeks of marriage became a story they'd tell years later, laughing about how they'd both been so scared of being hurt that they'd almost missed the best thing that ever happened to them. They'd tell it to their children, born from love rather than necessity, about how sometimes the things we do out of desperation lead us exactly where we need to be. Their story spread through the county, becoming something of a legend. The poor rancher who married for a cow, and the large woman nobody wanted, who together built an empire of their own making. People would point to their ranch, thriving where others had failed, and remember that love comes in forms we don't expect, between people others overlook, in places where only desperation and hope dare to grow. If this story of finding love and partnership in the most unexpected circumstances touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever found something beautiful in a situation that started out as pure necessity? Share your story with us. And if you enjoyed this tale from the Old West, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of courage, determination, and unexpected love on the frontier.